Okay, so these are just some hints for exercise 2 in problem set 11. So this is basically a detailed description of the framework. I'll not go through it now. I'll go through it when I cover it live later Monday. But I just want to say that we have a framework that's very similar to what we've seen before. This model is static, so there's only one period, and then furthermore, there is also an option of adopting a euro. So the country that we're basically considering is Denmark, and then there is an option of adopting the euro. So that's why this model will distinguish between shocks to the supply shocks to the eurozone and supply shocks to the Danish economy, where we assume that the supply shocks to the Danish economy have a larger volatility. Okay, so the first question says, as a benchmark, find the optimal monetary policy rule and the equilibrium inflation and output outcomes. Okay, so here are a few hints. So this is very similar to what we saw in, I think, exercise 2 in problem set 10. So I suggest that you also try and go back and sort of get an idea of how to do this. But the framework is a bit different because we now also have supply shocks. So from Pearson Tablini, page 399, I think, we know that as the loss function is quadratic, the optimal policy rule must be linear in potential output and supply shocks. So therefore we have that mt is equal to pi t, which is given by the following rule here. And because the private agents, they only observe theta t shocks to potential output and not these supply shocks, we have that the private agents' expectations are given by the following expression. Okay, so now use this rule for pi t to write up xt from the definition before here. And then use this to write up the loss function. And be aware that even though the model is static, I just include these subscript t on the variables. It doesn't really matter. Okay, so when you have found the exposed loss function by simply just plugging this rule into xt and then using the definition of the loss function, then we find the ex ante loss function simply just by taking expectations. Now, in order to characterize the optimal policy rule, we need to find these parameters, and we simply do this with first order conditions with respect to psi theta, and psi epsilon. Doing this, you find the optimal parameters, and by doing that, you can simply find a inflation under this monetary policy rule commitment rule by simply just plugging in the optimal parameters here, and then you can find output by using that you also know what the expectations in the private sector are, okay? And then see if you can try and explain this outcome. Now, question 2. So here we have that candidates from an anarchic party announced that they would follow a discretionary monetary policy. This follows since they announced that they will make the central bank behave according to the needs of the Ministry of Finance. Okay, so now we are asked to estimate inflation and output outcomes under this administration. Is monetary policy announced by the central bank credible? Okay, so again, this exercise is very similar to what you saw in problem set 10, exercise 2, and I think we also saw it in problem set 11, exercise 1 in a dynamic setting. But here we have supply shocks again. So just a few hints. We cannot make an assumption that private agents get their expectations right from a policy rule. As that's similar to what we had before here. So what you should do now is that you should simply just write up the loss function by using just the definition of output. So before we could plug this policy rule into the expression for inflation and expected inflation, we can't do that anymore. So we just write up the loss function by plugging in the definition of xt. Then take a first order condition with respect to pi t to find an expression for pi t, and then take expectations with this expression to get the private sector expectations about pi t, conditional on knowing theta t under this discretionary monetary policy regime. And what you should be aware of here is that private agents, they don't observe epsilon. Then plug this expectation back into the expression for pi t that you found with the first order condition. And now doing that, you should be able to tell what pi d here, so that's pi under inflation under a discretionary monetary policy, and the output is under discretionary monetary policy. And this expression for output follows from plugging in pi d here and then the expectations of pi into the definition of output. And then again try and explain the result. Now in question 3 or question C here, we're told a very conservative candidate would probably adopt the euro. Estimate the inflation growth rates under this administration, i.e. When there's a simple rule that fixes the inflation rate to the Eurozone 1.
Okay, so hints for question 3. So the first thing that you should notice is that there certainly is a typo in the original question. So here we were given that the equilibrium inflation for the euro was given by the following expression here, but we should definitely have that it should be this expression instead. So the way you can see it is basically that surely a higher preference for output stabilization, so that's what lambda EU basically is, that would imply that more of a supply shock in the Eurozone should be passed into inflation instead of output, right? And that's what we have if lambda here tends to infinity, then we would have that the whole supply shock would be passed into the inflation, where instead in this case here we would have that when lambda would tend to infinity, then we'd have that none of the supply shock was passed into inflation. Okay, and also if you have already solved question 1 at this point, you should also sort of be able to see why this must be the case, but I'll not tell you why. Okay, so in this question you have been given the inflation rate already. So what you should figure out is basically what will the expectations of households be conditional on observing theta t only. So what if they know that inflation is basically set this way, then what do the households expect? Use this to find xt, the output. And one thing that you should keep in mind is that domestic shocks epsilon t are different from shocks to the Eurozone epsilon t EU. So these are two different kinds of shocks, okay? So let's now consider question 4 or question D. A moderately populous candidate would opt for a rule that determines the rate of growth of money as a function of theta. Estimate the inflation and growth rates under this rule under the assumption that it's a linear rule. So m equals 2a plus b theta. Find the optimal parameters a and b. Okay, so these hints, they're basically very similar to the hints for question 1. The optimum policy rule is linear in output in this case, and in potential output, and given by the following expression here, implying that the private agent's expectations of inflation conditional on observing theta t is now the same. Use this to find xt and the exposed loss function. Then based on the exposed loss function, find the ex ante loss function. So it's just the expectation of the loss. And then use first order conditions with respect to the parameters a and b to find optimal policy parameters. So what are the optimal a and b here for this candidate? And now, having found the optimal a and b, we can now tell what pi t will be under this sort of commitment rule. Now here I've called it pi c, but we could also call it, it's a populous candidate, so it's probably more reasonable to call it pi p and xp here. So it should be pi p and xp, What is inflation pi p and output xp under this new policy rule? Explain. And again, here you should basically just follow the steps that you also followed in question 1, but you should notice that that the candidate now doesn't have a parameter that controls the effect of supply shocks on inflation and money growth. Okay. So now question 5 or question E. Your favorite candidate would choose to have an independent central bank choosing the preferences of the central banker lambda b in an optimal way. Estimate the inflation and growth rates. Okay, so hints for this question. I think this is a quite difficult question, but it's very similar to what we considered last week. So here you might want to follow the approach that we followed in problem set 11, exercise 1, question 2, or question B. So it's the approach that we used to characterize the optimal central banker for the party that was that had the power in the second period in that question. So that's what I mean here. Remember that now the problem is static rather than dynamic. Okay. So this was a quite difficult question in the last problem set, but I suggest that you go back now and then basically follow the same steps to characterize the optimal central banker for this candidate here in this static case. So the overall approach is find the values of the central banker preference parameter lambda b for which the inflation rate and output chosen by the central banker, so that's pi tb and xtb, make Denmark, this country D here, better off. And this is done by assuming that the central banker follows discretionary monetary policy, so you can use the solution from question 2 basically to characterize the behavior of the central banker based on the central banker's preferences, and plug the solution of the central banker into the loss function of Denmark, right? So you let lambda b decide the discretionary policy being carried out by the central banker, and then you plug those equilibrium outcomes, you can say. You plug those outcomes into the loss function of the candidate that has the lambda d preference parameter. Okay, but again, you can follow the approach from problem set 11, exercise 1, question 2, or question B. So now I consider these 3 questions together basically simultaneously because they're very similar and they depend on each other, you can say. So question F, question 6 here is determine under what conditions the simple rule of C is preferable to the simple rule of D. And then question G here, or question 7, determine under what conditions discretionary policy of B is preferable to the simple rule of C. And then question H, or question 8, we asked, show that society's welfare is maximized under your favorite candidate's administration. Okay, so the hints for these questions are the following. So first, compare the expected loss associated with the populist and the conservative candidate by plugging their solutions into the loss function and reduce. Okay, so basically you should, what you do is you take the outcomes, the xt and pi t in each of these 2 cases for the populist and the conservative candidate, and then plug it into the loss function and take expectations. And doing that, you should basically be able to see that one of these 2 candidates will generally have a higher expected loss than the other one. So the candidate with the lowest expected loss will basically be sort of preferred in a sense. Then compare the expected loss associated with the anarchic and the conservative candidate by plugging their solutions into the loss function reducing. So you basically do the same thing as before. You find the outcomes associated with each of these 2 candidates. You plug the outcomes into the loss function, and you take expectations. Now you can't really tell unambiguously what candidate is has a lower expected loss than the other one. You have a trade-off, but this trade-off is not too different from what we had in last week in problem set 11, exercise 1, question 3 or question C. But because we also now have sort of different supply shocks to the Eurozone, the trade-off looks mathematically a bit different. Okay. So try and explain what's going on when you have solved this. Then show that conditional on preferences of the central banker, so that's lambda b, the central banker can both implement the outcome of the populist candidate and the anarchic candidate. So you should basically be able to show that for a certain value of lambda b, the central banker implements the outcome of the populist candidate, and for another value of lambda b, the central banker basically implements the outcome of the anarchic candidate. Okay. Then finally, use these three results here to argue that the central banker must dominate the populist, the conservative, and the anarchic candidates. Okay. And this is basically just by logics. You just use the three results that you have here, and from these results you should basically be able to see why the central banker must dominate these three other candidates. Okay, and now finally question 9 or question I. Assume now that the supply shocks of Europe and Denmark are correlated, positively or negatively, and denote alpha the coefficient of correlation. Find the ex-ante social loss function for C. For what values of alpha is it more convenient to adopt the euro? Okay, so now finally hints for this question. So the first thing that you should do is that you should plug the outcomes of the conservative candidate into the expected loss function. Then you have done this before in the previous set of questions. Then take expectations and now take into account that epsilon t and epsilon t EU, so is the domestic supply shocks and the supply shocks to the Eurozone are now correlated. Okay, and then you basically use the following rule here. There should be an end parenthesis here, but you should basically take into account that this thing now here is not necessarily zero. That's what we had before, because that when these two types of shocks were uncorrelated, then the expectation of these two shocks multiplied onto each other would just be zero. Now they're not, and you can use the following formula here. So now you should consider, is the expected loss increasing or decreasing in alpha, the coefficient of correlation? Is it increasing or decreasing in this? And try and explain intuitively why whatever you find here is the case. So apply intuition and see if you can tell why this is either increasing or decreasing in alpha. And then, sort of as a difficult thing, you can try and compare the outcome here with the policy from question 1. Will adopting the euro ever be better for certain values of alpha? Why or why not? Okay, so good luck with these questions. Remember that you can always, if you get stuck somewhere, if you want to sort of confirm your results, you can just log into the usual Zoom meeting room between 10 a.m. and around 12 before I cover the solutions, and then you can discuss the different questions or the results with me. Okay, I'll be available. Okay, so good luck.